Hello, and thank you for joining this second installment of the Hamilton Community Benefits Network series, exploring how community benefits can look in the city of Hamilton through the lens of other communities. Really appreciate you joining me. Today, we're doing lessons from Windsor, community benefits agreements in the Windsor-Essex, and building community wealth. What is possible in small and mid-sized communities? A conversation with the Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition. Joining me is Brady, Holek, Community Benefits Coordinator with the Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition, and Frazier Fathers, co-author of the paper, Building Community Wealth, What is Possible in Small and Mid-Sized Communities. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
Thanks. Yeah, excited to be here.
I'm going to start with you, Bradley. If you can give us an introduction of some of the work and yourself and what's going on down there in Windsor-Essex.
Sure. Yeah, I'm from the Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition. Hello, everyone. The Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition, we're made up of volunteers from community organizations, local institutions, and regional residents who wish to have community benefits leverage to better the lives of all people in our region. Our history goes back to 2016 when the United Way was approached about their ability to engage with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority regarding community benefit agreements as a part of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. So through support of a grant from the Atkinson Foundation, a series of public meetings were held to engage the community of West Windsor, kind of focusing on the neighborhood's vision for community benefits in relation to the Gordie Howe Bridge. And as a result, the Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition was formed. And then in 2018, we were able to get some more funding with a mandate to build upon the work we've already accomplished and to reach out to the wider Windsor-Essex community. So as a result, the first full-time staff member was hired on, and we've continued to engage the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and Bridging North America in their community benefits processes. We did have a little bit of a rough patch with COVID. Obviously, everybody did, but we're back on track. We've adjusted and strengthening the connections in the community, focusing on not only large-scale community benefits, but also mid-sized projects and ways Windsor-Essex communities can benefit from all forms of construction and infrastructure projects.
Thank you very much. Fraser Fathers, you were involved in the Community Benefits Coalition originally. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and your involvement in the paper as well?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frazier. I was previously, and as Brady sort of alluded to, employed at United Way, Windsor-Essex. I was their manager of community impact and then later on director of advocacy there. I've just recently moved on. So one of the last things I actually did at United Way was actually help finish up this paper and get it released to the community. So it was a great pleasure to do that work. And so I was actually the staff person that was tasked back in 2016 to really kick off the Windsor-Essex community benefits work and the work around the Gordie Howe Bridge. And I was the one, knocking on doors and holding a lot of those community meetings back in 2016 around visioning what could be possible from community benefits. And I think there's a really good quote that that the coalition chairperson, Mike Cardinal, uses, where the benefit has to balance the burden, right? And so in many cases, these big infrastructure projects, they bring new things, they, improve communities, but there's usually a burden or someone living right next door to it who, and so you have to come up with a way to balance that out. And the report really took that concept and tried to sort of right size it away from mega projects like the Gordie Howe Bridge and, Hamilton talking about an LRT, to how do we shrink that down to a library or, a commercial development of some sort or an industrial development or just a road project. How do we right size some of these things to sort of weave community benefits and social procurement and other community wealth building strategies into multiple classes of project, so that, there's always some added value from work that's going to be done anyways.
Thank you very much. So I've got some questions for you guys. I guess I'd like to ask you both, why are you so passionate about community benefits and what got you involved in them?
I can go first, I guess.
Sure.
So, what got me involved was my boss sort of going and saying, okay, we got this bridge coming in. Let's figure out what these community benefits are. And let's get the community involved. But it was a really, interesting learning process for myself, in that back in 2016, I had no idea what community benefits were. I had, Windsor is a smaller community. You know, there's only about 200,000 people in the city of Windsor, and then about 200,000 people in the rest of Essex County. And so there isn't a lot of big projects in these communities that would justify even talking about community benefits on a regular basis. But I think the really interesting part, and the thing that really keeps me excited in these tools is, you know, is when you see how residents can get involved and how projects can be improved upon, and then how that creates, you know, added value for the community and synergies for the community and overall just a better community. I think that they're a really interesting and powerful tool for positive change.
Brady?
Yeah, I'm much like Fraser. I didn't really know too much about community benefits until they came around with the Gordie Howe International Bridge. And even back then, I was interested. I remember Fraser holding meetings back in 2016 in our Mackenzie Hall in the West End area. I live in the project area at the time, and I still live pretty close. And going to those meetings and kind of keeping an eye on what had happened over the years, I was very interested in becoming a part of it. Unfortunately, at the time, I had a different position, like a different job, and I was a little worried about the time commitment to kind of really dig in and join in. And once the position of coordinator became available, I was more than excited to jump at it. And because I think, much like Fraser was saying, it's a very positive. Community benefits are extremely positive for communities in general, and anything to be a part of helping to build that up is something I'm excited about.
So, question for you, Brady. Can you tell me about the Gordie Howe International Bridge and just what this major project is? Just a little bit of background.
Yeah, sure. Just to give you a brief update on like even the timeline of it, the Gordie Howe Bridge just reached 1,000 days of construction. There's an estimated completion date of 2024. The WECBC has been involved in the construction process since 2016. It's a very large project. There's 4 different major project sites. There's the bridge itself. There's the Canadian port of entry, U.S. port of entry, and a Michigan interchange. And we were able to secure a form of community benefit agreement. It's a little different than some others. It's a community benefit plan. So it's not a legally binding contract. So there's a little bit less power to enforce the details of their plan. But the WDBA do offer regular reporting and are extremely communicative with our organization. We definitely built a long-term relationship with them and are continuing to work with them to fulfill that community benefits plan. And in terms of the deliverables, their plan is split into 2 major components. There's a workforce development and participation strategy. It's kind of geared towards engaging businesses and focusing on supporting workforce training and pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship opportunities. So as an example, they have to have at least $250 million of the total value of the work during the design and build phase in Canada performed by, contracted to, or supplied by workers or contractors located in Windsor-Essex County. And the other section of their plan is a neighborhood infrastructure strategy that's focused on collaborating with stakeholders and community members through consultation to develop a community investment strategy based on identified priorities. So for an example of that, there's $2.75 million going into aesthetic and landscaping investments. There's $1.47 million going into community partnerships, and it kind of trickles down from there. You can actually go to their website and take a look at the full 40-page plan that outlines community benefits for Windsor and Detroit. So it's very large.
So, before we dive into some of those, can you tell me what was the role CBC played in the CBA negotiations? How did that unfold? How did you get involved? And
yeah, like anytime, Fraser, if you want to jump in, that's fine. But I do know that initially the WDBA reached out to the United Way and some other community partners, and kind of, as I said, through that community engagement, the Windsor-Essex Community Benefits Coalition was formed. And there were definitely several months of public meetings to collect community input and organize that input. I know that eventually there became kind of pillars of different things that were identified as potential community benefits, and that was all submitted to WDBA. And then I do know that continued for another 6 months. Am I right, Fraser? And even more consultation processes happened kind of by continuing to advocate for community benefits. We were able to kind of get a little bit more detailed with WDBA and bring in the info that we found to help lobby for community benefits on this project in a way where, when you look at the plan now, most of those identifiers were all things that the community spoke about and wanted to see.
Yeah, so I would just add to that, the one challenge that was really there was because it's an international project, first of all, so there's sort of a Canadian side and an American side. And so on the US side, because the bridge, just the neighborhood the bridge was going to land in, is very much a residential neighborhood. And so that side of the bridge, and in the South Detroit and the Delray neighborhood, for a long time has had a well-established sort of community organization. The bridge is landing on the Canadian side in what was a brownfield industrial area at the fringes. The initial impetus of getting involved was the WDBA, to their credit, which is the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, which is the Crown Corporation. It's a federal corporation that oversees this bridge. They recognized, we have this really strong, historic neighborhood group on the American side doing all this organization and doing all this work, and nothing was happening on the Canadian side. And that was sort of the impetus a little bit of that. And the Atkinson Foundation also, who supports the coalition, saw that as well. And so they were that was sort of the impetus of the coalition sort of getting going and the engagement process really going. I think one of the big challenges, or one of the big pieces of that puzzle, though, was because everything was run through this Crown Corporation. There's a level of bureaucratic inertia, and also sometimes just and because it's an international project, the legalese of there was no formal negotiation between the community and the proponents and the Crown Corp, because of the legal structure of the P3, because it had to abide by the laws of two different countries. So all they could do was take the community input and share it with the proponents. And then the proponents, as a part of their submission, were scored on community engagement and pieces of that process and what community benefits they were going to do. And so there wasn't like a traditional, like what you've heard in sort of Toronto and what we're hoping will probably happen in Hamilton, where, community representatives can sit down with the builders and talk like, here's what we want in this neighborhood. Unfortunately, that just wasn't possible. Like, we were told straight out of the gate, that will never happen because there's, international treaties involved in building this bridge. But we ended up getting about 75% of what the community asked for, ended up in that community benefit package, and ended up in that employment and workforce development package that was eventually deployed. So, obviously we obviously want 100%, but for a first kick at the can, I think we did a pretty good job of what we were able to get.
So I guess that leads into my next couple of questions, which is what gains do you guys sort of wish that could have been extracted from the project, or you had heard from residents that you wish had been extracted from the projects? And then what gains did you hear from residents that were just kind of impossible to even conceive or frame? Or I know sometimes when you do community engagement, you can get all kinds of ideas from all kinds of folks. Can you guys both explore those two concepts for me?
Yeah, so I think I'll start, and then Brady can sort of talk about one of the big pieces that that's still being worked on, which is a legacy fund. But one of the big gains were on the Canadian side. The bridge is landing right next to a neighborhood called Sandwich Town, which is it's a historic section of the city. It's one of the oldest established communities west of Montreal. There's tons of history. Mackenzie Hall, that Brady had mentioned, was built by I forget which Mackenzie it was, but he was like the second prime minister of Canada type of thing. Like, he was the architect on that building. And so there was a lot of conversation about sort of this preserving and protecting and enhancing the historic neighborhood that's right next door there. At the same time, West Windsor, where Sandwich Town resides, is also a neighborhood with a child poverty rate over 50%. as of the 2016 census. So there was a recognition of, creating some pathways for economic and social mobility and providing supports to that community. I think the community benefit tool, or what was sort of gotten out of the package, certainly protects the infrastructure side, in the neighborhood development side. I think there's a little bit less on the social development side. And that was just where the chips sort of fell. I think they there is some money for, school programs and stuff like that to learn about the bridge. And they do some good work in engaging the bridge. But, of that $250 million that Brady mentioned, having to be spent on Windsor-Essex contractors and job training in Windsor-Essex, as of right now, I couldn't probably tell you exactly how many people out of West Windsor have gotten jobs on the job site right now. Like, that's not something that is readily available information. And I think there's some work that has to be done in that space, I think. One thing that really, right next to the Gordie Howe Bridge, is on the other side of the bridge is actually the Ojibwe Prairie Complex and the Ojibwe Park Complex. And this is like one of the last undeveloped sections of waterway or waterfront along the Detroit River and the sort of between Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. And so there was a lot of discussion around environmental protection for that sort of natural heritage area. And, there's currently a discussion and a debate going on and advocacy happening in the community about turning it into an urban national park, kind of like the Rouge River area in Toronto, because it is sort of this last vestige of that sort of space in our region. There was a lot of discussion during that period about currently the waterfront is actually owned by the Port Authority, though, in Windsor. And so there was a lot of discussion of, could the bridge just give us $20 million to buy this giant chunk of land from the port to just, ensure that it never gets developed? Because in theory, the port tomorrow could decide to go in there and cut down the trees and put up, a storage yard or whatever. And I don't think they would ever do that. But I think, in theory, they have that ability because they own that land. That was one thing that was hotly debated during that process around and it got really complicated because you have this federal crown corporation that would have to buy land from a regulated port authority. And, what seems to be a pretty easy thing from a community perspective of just give them some money. The federal government gives one part of the federal government money, really wasn't. And so it was one of those things that just never really materialized in a significant way in the community benefit process.
Yeah, and to add to that, Fraser, something else, when you mention which gains do you wish you'd gotten, I always think of what gains have we not gotten yet, because there is still opportunity here. And one of those things is for a legacy fund. And what we're talking about with that is in the future to kind of mitigate any potential problems, but also to continue to provide the community with funding for specific things. So an example would be, actually, what we're looking for is a portion of that bridge toll that comes out to go back into the community itself. And a good example of that is something that the Gordie Howe International Bridge is already doing, which is a community organization investment fund that happens every year, where they basically give out $50,000 on each side of the border to nonprofits, community organizations to improve infrastructure or to hold community events and to celebrate things like history or build a new wheelchair ramp or something like that. And that ends when the bridge is finished being built. But if we had something like a legacy fund, like a continued kind of investment in the community, we could see something like that continue every year for the foreseeable future. So that's definitely something we're really working hard towards and kind of engaging still with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, and as well as at a federal level as well, trying to, get politicians to agree to put a little bit of money back into the community here in Windsor.
So when you've found during these negotiations or conversations with the community and bringing forward those community requests, did you find that public pressure and residents played a lot more of a role than say it would in Toronto and possibly in Hamilton, although we don't know what our process will look like yet.
Yeah, like I think thinking back, there was, a lot of door knocking and a lot of like grassroots organizing that occurred during that initial consultation process. One of the advantages of being a sort of a smaller city, Windsor does still have a pretty decent legacy media footprint. So if you put out a media release in Windsor, generally you can get, the Windsor Star, the CBC, CTV, and various other affiliates to all sort of show up to your event and get the word out pretty well. And so that was something that we leveraged during that process. So as we were sort of going through the process, not only were we letting the neighborhood know, hey, we're going to be hosting an event at, Mackenzie Hall, but then we were also letting the wider community know and getting media coverage to then plant that seed in the rest of the region. Because we knew that even though Sandwichtown and West Windsor were the primary beneficiary areas or primary impacted community would need to be the primary beneficiary, we also knew that there would have to be we had to be able to articulate what are some of those broader spillover effects that, that LaSalle, for example, which is a neighboring municipality right next to Windsor, which is largely suburban and has very different socioeconomic and community needs than West Windsor. What would be some of the spillover benefits of that? And so one of the things there is, there's actually going to be a permanent separated bike lane on the bridge. We're allowing you to ride your bike across the border to Detroit, and you can go bike around in Detroit for a day. Well, some of the conversation is then, well, how do you connect that bike lane to LaSalle's bike infrastructure right next door, right? And starting some of those conversations about, well, where are these logical linkages? And we didn't do a lot of that work. There's some other community groups in the cycling space and environmental space, but it was really just about getting those other partners aware of, hey, this pot of activity is going to be occurring and there's going to be resources from these community benefits to then move that work forward and then inviting them to the table, right? And so it was about them then, joining some of those initial coalition meetings and, being a part of those conversations and moving that, and then, when we got to the end of the day, when we had sort of that final report that sort of listed all the community demands, many of those partners signed on to that report saying, this isn't just the residents, but it's also these groups and it's these other, United Way as sort of signed on. We even had a local hospital, which is in West Windsor, sign on. Even though they weren't going to get a whole heck of a lot out of it, they were willing to, support, because they saw it as their mandate as, benefiting the community that they serve. And so we were able to get a broad swath of the community to sort of sign off and support on that those endorsed elements. And, it started with, literally going door to door and knocking on hundreds of doors in West Windsor and building up from there.
So was there any pushback or revocation of commitments that had been made? I'm thinking about what happened in the Finch West LRT with the proposed community hub that was withdrawn, and then it took a great deal of community pushback and community organizing and pressure to then get that back on the table. Did you guys encounter any of those challenges or situations?
So there hasn't, to my knowledge, there hasn't been anything that's been like completely pulled off the table. There has been, obviously there were delays due to COVID. A number of the funding recipients and opportunities were very community focused. And so as a result of there being no community gatherings for the last 18 months, for example, they couldn't fund community events, and therefore certain dollars probably didn't get spent. And as a result, I think a few of the projects that were sort of some of the smaller ones that Brady was sort of describing and listed on the Community Benefit Coalition's web or on the WDBA's website probably haven't moved forward. But overall, I would say, and Brady, feel free to sort of build on this, like I think everything is still largely on track.
Yeah, like I would say for sure. Whenever we communicate with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and we talk about community benefits, they are very quick to say, like, this hasn't happened yet, but it is still going to happen. Most of the stuff, as Fraser said, has just mostly been due to COVID restrictions and things like that. But even something like that community organization investment funding I was mentioning, the recipients of last year obviously weren't able to put some of the community events on, but that funding is still in place for them, and they will be still holding those events in the future. So overall, I think it's been fantastic in terms of the delivering of the actual benefits. And as I said, it's not a full agreement, but I have yet to see any kind of major backsliding on or anything like that.
So, how much role did your city and region play in these conversations that were happening in the final outcome of the community benefits plan, and of course, some of the discussions with higher levels of government?
So the city was not really formally a part of the community benefit process when we really moved it forward. There were, and we're well aware of, separate channels of conversation, sort of like the municipalities were sort of talking over here, the community was talking over here, and all that got fed up to the WDBA, who was the Crown Corporation, and they sort of then brought it all together. You know, and that's not to be critical of the city. Some municipalities did participate in some of our engagement efforts during the process. So we were able to actually sit down with the executive leadership team of the town of LaSalle, which is just on the other side of the bridge. And, you know, we were able to get input on that from them, being a municipality of about 30,000 people that's going to see, you know, this bridge just north of them be built, what their thoughts were. And so they were able to give some input, but municipalities had their own sort of channel of communication with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority. And you do see it in the community benefit package in that there was, for example, there is streetscaping, for example. So Sandwich Street, which is sort of the main road right through Sandwich Town, which is just a street in the city of Windsor for the most part. That's all going to get streetscaped as a part of the community benefit package using federal dollars, right? And so, or using community benefit dollars. So it's you can see where some items were, you know, we knew that conversation was happening from a city perspective. Our point of engagement on those were really around what features then get put into that streetscaping. So we want separated bike lanes, and we want, you know, to ensure that, you know, trees get planted along the road and all of those sort of things, and ensure that the historic nature of the community was really protected. So there were the municipalities weren't really they were around some of those conversations, but they had also their own sort of advocacy and communication channel to the WDBA as a part of that process at that point in time.
So, Brady, I want to talk to you about some of the smaller Windsor-Essex community benefits. Can you tell me a bit about them?
You just mean like what we're working on currently, kind of stuff?
Yes, please.
Yeah?
What you're working on? Some of the
Sure.
things that are happening in the community. One of the focuses we wanted to talk about was drawing away from the large-scale infrastructure projects down and drilling down a little bit. And you're a small region, so can you give us a little bit of insight?
Yeah, sure. Like currently, something we've really been kind of advocating and pushing for is the fact that just outside of our town, the Highway 3 is being expanded, and it's going to be going from 2 to 4 lanes from Essex to Leamington. And that has been something we've really it's been a really good opportunity because we haven't really been out in that area of the county before. And it's been a huge, not only outreach, but educational kind of time for us, just kind of letting people know what community benefits are and how they can be scaled down. And it's been great as well to kind of take a look at different structures from the report that actually just recently got put out and kind of apply that to this and say, how does workforce development fit in? How does surplus land utilization fit in? And even environmental benefits and things like that you look at on a smaller scale and kind of push those forward. So that's definitely something we've really been working on. Coming down the line to, there's going to be a provincially funded mega hospital in the future in the next few years here in Windsor. There's already been $9.8 million announced in the last budget for it to bring us into stage 2 of 5. So that's definitely something else we're going to be working on a lot, as well as kind of leveraging the large-scale community benefit agreement that we have and use that to push for changes federally and provincially to make sure community benefit provisions are included in all kinds of infrastructure projects.
So, Father, I want to talk to you now about, of course, your paper that you helped pen, the Community Wealth: What is Possible in Small and Mid-Sized Communities. You alluded a little bit to it in the introduction. Can you kind of just expand on it a bit?
Yeah. So this report was really the beginning of this report was actually sort of the initial conversations that happened after the WDBA work sort of wrapped up, and we were sort of thinking about, well, what's next, right? And Brady just sort of talked about some of those other projects, but we started having some initial conversations, myself at United Way, as well as the coordinator at the time, with some local officials and things like that, and individuals like that in the community. And what we really were hearing was, well, community benefits only happen on these mega projects, or they only happen in Toronto, or when, the federal government decides that we get something like that. So they can't really work here. And even from, we even heard things like that in Windsor, to set some context, Windsor was, just like Hamilton was hit really hard during the recessions, 08, 09, 2010. And economically was just starting to recover in, 2016, 17. And so there was a lot of trepidation around, if you go and start asking developers, there was no development. So the fact that development was even just starting to happen, that was a benefit unto itself for our region. That was somewhat of the mindset that we had in our region at that time. And so this report was a long time coming. And really, the goal of it was to try and right-size some thinking and break up some of those big community benefit sort of elements into smaller, more bite-sized elements that could be picked off piece by piece in a particular community or in a smaller community on a smaller project. So we're talking about, like, okay, you're going to build a library. Every municipality builds a library. What are some of the core steps that we should include in building a library to get some added value out of just this beyond just you're going to build a new community amenity? And so it really outlines, the report's really designed to be sort of a point of inspiration and sort of like what has happened in some of these other communities, in smaller, mid-sized communities. And then how, and then to hopefully start some people thinking about, well, how could we replicate that here? That's sort of the goal of the report.
So a good example that I can think of comes to mind is the London Children's Museum, mm-hmm. that did include a CBA in the creation of their new Children's Museum. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the London Children's Museum, actually, so that's one of the projects. I think in the report it makes it sound like it's almost done. It's not quite as far along as it is because of COVID, but in essence, they're a community organization. They have a museum. They've outgrown more or less. And so they're going to spend, I believe, in that range of between $10 and $20 million. They're currently fundraising and working with community partners and to sort of secure the revenue in order to build their new museum for their community. But one of the things that they've committed to is working with their contractors and working with their developers to, include some of these broader community benefit elements. So they are looking at things like not just how everything, including the community and everything from how they are designing their museum and who's going to be sort of that user base. So they're designing a museum for kids. So let's give kids an opportunity to think about what the museum should look like a little bit there, to also, talking to their developer about, who they hire to actually do the work on the project. So it's a really interesting example. They're learning while doing in London right now. And so if you have these conversations with the groups in London going forward, you can probably hear a far better and more detailed sort of example of how they're moving that work forward. But I think it's an example of, where a nonprofit can, do this work too. And so when you're thinking about, you have a YMCA looking to build a new facility, or take your pick of community organization, anyone can do this. It's really just a question of how do you do it? And that's sort of what the report is hopefully going to help reveal some of the opportunity of doing those things.
So smaller communities, though, do face challenges that we should probably talk about in terms of the ability to have resources, either both at the city, regional level, as well as the community organizing level. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of those challenges and pitfalls?
Yeah. So just starting at the community organization side, and Brady can talk to this, and I think you can relate to it as well, Carl. It's Brady's a team of one, right? And and there's not the local resources quite often to fund a robust, independent community benefit sort of voice in a lot of those smaller communities. So that creates some challenges. Just to do the organization work. That initial consultation that United Way supported, well, I was more or less seconded from my United Way role to go do that work. I had pretty much the summer. I was told, go do it, go get it done. And I went and got it done. But there isn't a community benefit organizer role at United Way Windsor-Essex, and on staff, and so if some of those external funding sources aren't there, the question becomes who does the work, because in the nonprofit community organizing space, there's always another challenge, right? And so there's always that challenge going on in the community that makes it really hard to add one more task, one more consultation to that workload. I think at a municipal level too, there are, challenges as well, particularly when you're dealing with smaller communities. So the towns of like Leamington and Kingsville and Essex that Brady were talking about, they have planning departments of 2, 3, and 4 people, and during the summer, they have to take turns who goes on vacation when, just so that they have someone on staff who's a planner to answer the phone, sort of thing. And so there's a challenge there of just the manpower of the municipalities in order to just understand and then manage these processes. And then also because in some ways it's like, oh, it's one more thing you're going to ask an already busy planning department to potentially do. But then it's also about they don't have the institutional bandwidth in some cases to go and really learn in innovative ways, or go and see by doing in some cases, unless someone can come to them. And, that's sort of what Brady was alluding to around the educational opportunities of I think he's been able to go out and like sit down with small town municipal councils and talk to them and, explain to them how these can work in their communities too. And I think that's a great value. But if Brady wasn't there to do that work and to go to them, I would question whether or not they're going to come to you just because they may not be aware, or they just don't have time in order to do that.
So Hamilton's been really lucky. We have a large-scale project in the Hamilton LRT, $3.4 billion investment from both the federal and provincial governments to build our community benefits agreement on. But we don't have a social procurement policy yet. So this is one of the things that was spoken about in the paper, and is a possible tool that could be used by cities large and small. Can both of you kind of talk about what social procurement is and how it can be applied to cities both large and small, especially maybe in the Hamilton context?
Yeah, so I'll just start off, and Brady can jump in, I guess. In many ways, social procurement is just trying to maximize the value of the dollars that are going to be spent anyways, right? And trying to keep those dollars in local communities, or create added value of those dollars through whatever process or whatever purchase you're making. So that could be as simple as buying from local stores, the food that you're going to get for your catering, rather than maybe using mega corporation A, doing your catering at your events. So it's not going to solve every issue, in that there is a level of capacity building that's needed there, and that for many small businesses, in some cases, they see working with the municipality as, an onerous thing that they don't want to do, because it's actually going to take them more time and be more effort than it's actually worth. But yeah, I think social procurement has the ability of, just leveraging dollars that are going to be spent otherwise, and trying to create a more circular economy from them, and enable those dollars to really stay in local communities.
Brady?
Yeah. Well, and also that kind of provision, as to build on what Fraser was saying, ensures the purchases that need to be made are targeted and used as an opportunity to buy directly from local or support that kind of business owned by equity seeking populations. And I think that's another major component, is providing those equity seeking groups the opportunity for workforce development training. You can kind of create that local support through that, and consistently ask how a project can provide that additional value while maintaining those positive returns on investments for taxpayers. I think that's really what you're looking at. And a lot of ways I've seen it happen in a lot of community benefit agreements is even just like a 10% hiring quota for BIPOC individuals or local groups that live right in the project area, and kind of helping bring up that equity.
So cities like Toronto and Vancouver have kind of codified a solid social procurement policy into all of their procurement processes. Would that be a tool you think would make it easier for smaller communities to then go ahead, who lack the resources, to apply community benefits to their purchasing process? And do you guys have any idea what that might look like? Or
Yeah, I think it would be a tool. And I think it's like, to be fair, I think a lot of social procurement occurs already in a lot of communities. It's just not codified under that umbrella of social procurement. I think, and I don't have a stat, like a formal stat, but I've heard, in Windsor, the city of Windsor, on all of its road projects, there was something in a report at some point in time, and they're like 2/3 of all the construction crews from road projects in Windsor are Windsor-based construction crews. And so, like, in theory, they're already paying, Windsor companies to do work in Windsor, to work on roads in Windsor. And, a lot of that's already happening. It's just not being tracked or codified. And that's the other piece that really the policy work that Toronto and Vancouver have done, is they've built out a methodology and they've built out sort of processes internally at a municipality to then track those dollars that are already being used for good. And they're already out there being used in that way. The barrier to entry there, obviously, for some municipalities, and Hamilton may be in a different spot, is obviously it takes time and energy at a municipal level to then build out those policies and then implement those policies and then, report on those policies. And so depending on the capacity of the municipality, certainly there are smaller municipalities that would struggle with that. But out in BC, there's the Coastal Communities Partnership out on Vancouver Island, which is like 10 small municipalities, and they're doing that work collaboratively, right? And so they've almost elevated it to a regional level, where as a region, they've set, sort of adopted a set of common standards, and they're sort of tracking it at that regional level across parts of Vancouver Island around social procurement. So it can be done in smaller communities. Peterborough was exploring, it didn't pass municipal council, but Peterborough was exploring sort of back in 2018-19 a social procurement policy, and they're a much smaller community than even Windsor is. And so, it can be done. There's a path, there's a process of education and awareness, I think, that has to be really put in place first, though, in some cases.
So drilling down just a little bit on social procurement policy and how it can have some benefits at the most community level. When you're talking about, say, putting out a tender for security guards, and you would like to, for example, employ more women into the security fields, you would then have to figure out how and what would you need to put into that social procurement contract or RFP in order to make sure that more women are employed on that project. Are there other examples that you can think of where or what kinds of social procurements, just to get folks thinking about, how social procurement we're talking very high level here, so we kind of need to raise or focus it down to, for example, ensuring there was childcare put into the RFP process, or flex work time, for example, so that they could employ perhaps more mothers. Are there other low-level social procurement policies that you can kind of talk to us about to take the lofty idea and kind of bring it down?
Yeah, so I know in Toronto, for example, the municipality has pretty much said that for any purchase under $20,000, I believe, pretty much staff have authorization to sort of go and buy what you need to buy. But they have a social procurement list where BIPOC-owned businesses and Indigenous-owned businesses are registered with the city, and their services are listed there. And one of the policy pieces is for those purchases under $20,000, city staff have to go to that list first before they go to whomever to buy whatever they need to buy. And so whether that's, for example, maybe it's designing a logo, or it's marketing purchases or printing purchases. You got to flyer a neighborhood, so we need 1,000 copies of something. Or it could be food for events, and things like that. So that's another example that I've seen, and I've seen that a little bit more often. I've seen it both in municipalities and then outside of municipalities. Sometimes community organizations sort of cater and maintain that list of, community organizations or social enterprises that are providing services and add additional value, so that both municipality and other organizations can purchase services from those organizations in a targeted way. So that's another type of example that I've seen sort of come to mind, where the social procurement part is the actual purchasing from those organizations, but the methodology and the framework there is the actual, well, they've curated this list, they know who these people are, they've vetted them so that who they are. And then that, in theory, the businesses are, supporting newcomers or women or visible minority populations in various neighborhoods across the city of Toronto. And so that's one way that it could be done, where on small purchases like that, you are target or incentivizing sort of dollars to be spent in certain ways with certain groups.
Thank you very much for that. So in the paper, there was a couple of other things that you explored in terms of beyond social procurement that small communities could look at. And one of them was talking about the changes in Ontario made by Bill 108 and 137 around community benefit charges. Can you talk to us a bit about what those are?
Yeah, so in essence, the community benefit charges are, and this is a complicated thing because it went through a couple iterations, as you mentioned, Bill 108 and then 138. And I think it's even been it's now being appealed in some ways to the LPAT. So who knows if all of this is going to even stand. But it's really, community benefits charges in some ways replace development charges and enhance them in some degrees for communities. So for those that aren't aware, whenever a house gets built or a building gets built, a municipality will charge the developer a fee, in essence, to cover the cost of the hard municipal infrastructure that is needed to support that, whether that's the road in front of the house, the park, the sidewalk, the sewer line that goes to in front of the house, to even transit services. If there's a bus stop that's going into, say, just down the road. So the province enhanced what could be charged under those lists. So it added things like childcare centers, long-term care facilities, parks and recreational facilities. In some cases, some of those elements were allowed in some communities and and not in other communities. It was sort of a hodgepodge previously. But in essence, they've broadened the definition of what could be costs recovered from the city through these development charges. And so in theory, many municipalities over the coming years, when they have to redefine their building permits, because they have to do that, or development charge cost structures, they have to do that every 5 years, I believe. And each municipality is on a slightly different calendar for that. When they go and do that the next time, they will have to update those fees to augment for these additional services if they want them. So if a community already has enough community centers, in theory, they could put $0 charge for a community center as a part of this fee within this fee structure. If they don't have enough community centers, they then they can charge a fee for it, but then they have to have a report, in essence, justifying why are we charging every house $100 to help pay for a community center. So it's a complicated sort of tool that is now there that could, in theory, fund some social infrastructure in communities. Just as communities grow, it would help offset some of the costs of some of the social infrastructure, as well as the physical infrastructure that is needed to facilitate a community growing. Obviously, there are some challenges with it, and the report sort of outlines. First of all, there's the naming convention. They call it, community benefit charges, and it's really not like a community benefit. It's paying for infrastructure that municipalities were already cost recovering for anyways. So there's a bit of a branding issue there. And that was, I think, cynical me thinks that was a little intentional on the part of, making it sound like a community benefit makes it sound like, you're getting all these great things when really it's just to maintain what you already have or are going to need anyways. The other challenge is obviously there's no real requirement for significant community engagement within those charges. They're just something that's a part of the planning process in many ways. And so with the exception of when the municipality has to go through the process of updating its official plan and the community gets consulted as a part of that, there is no, if they're building a new, apartment building over here, there's no engagement process around how should these community benefit charges be spent. It's a common formula that's applied to an entire area of the city or a region that then would, in theory, be used to fund both hard and social infrastructure.
So yeah, just to clarify for anyone who isn't aware, development charges and potential community benefit charges are a one-time cost applied to developers to make sure that infrastructure pays for itself, so that the local taxpayer isn't out of pocket to subsidize a new development that's being created. For example, a condo tower going up in downtown Hamilton has a pile of development charges that are collected by the city on them in order to pay for any upgrades that are required to municipal sewer, any extra road or transit lines, as Fraser mentioned. So this is a one-time cost that's passed on to the developer, not an ongoing cost for a local municipality. But I want to talk about community engagement, because obviously that is the most important aspect of any community benefits agreement is getting as many community voices on board as possible and making sure that those get brought into the discussions around, in the Hamilton context, the Hamilton LRT. So how did you guys set about doing, I know you touched on it a bit, your community engagement? What challenges did you have, and who did you maybe forget or not get at the table when you were doing your community engagement?
Yeah, Brady can talk about the work he's doing right now out on Highway 3, but I'll just quickly touch on with the Gordie Bridge. Our challenge was we didn't have a lot of time, right? We had about 6 weeks in order to engage the community, just because of where we were in their planning process. They're like, you have to get us the list of asks by this day, otherwise, or it's not going to get included. And so obviously we would have loved to have 6 months or whatever to keep talking to people. And so we did. And at that time it was myself and a couple, interns and stuff like that. And some volunteers from the community. We knocked on, hundreds of doors, on weekends and in the evenings. But we ran into some barriers around language. Obviously I only speak English, but, we weren't able to penetrate into some portions of the West End community, our newcomer communities. And so we weren't able to get as much information or engage them as effectively as we had hoped as a part of that process. And then the other piece was, I think the other gap that we struggled with was just because there wasn't a fundamental understanding of what were community benefit agreements in the general public. And because we didn't have a lot of time, we didn't have the space to really educate. And so there's an education piece that has to occur in parallel to the community engagement piece, particularly on big, complicated projects, because if people don't understand, people will generally want to boil everything down to how is it going to impact them or how are they going to benefit. But if they don't understand the complication of, well, there's this legal agreement that's a community benefit agreement that might mean you get money, but we're building a list of asks that everyone would want. Some people are just like, I don't know, I'd like a new park bench, like they don't make the informed input isn't always there.
Brady?
Yeah, I found, like, for me, it's been a very different time, because like I was hired on late last year and have had to do everything from home. And I think like easily a huge challenge is the fact that COVID has put certain organizations they weren't even open at the time. So you're like missing out on the chance to connect with them and get all of their input. That's definitely been easily the biggest challenge that I've faced. And also the fact that without being able to get on the ground and going to see people, you're gonna eventually something's gonna slip through the cracks. And I think that it's really important to continue the kind of advocacy work that Frazier's talking about as well, like going and knocking on doors and seeing people face to face. And that easily has been the biggest challenge I've seen.
Here in Hamilton, prior to the last cancellation of the Hamilton LRT project, we had engaged in some community conversations where we would invite the public to join us, most often at the Hamilton Public Library, and run a series of sessions where we tried to draw out community benefits input from the broader community. What tools did you guys? I know you had a short time frame, Fraser. So how, besides door knocking, were there events? What did you guys do in order to get some of that community information?
Yeah, we did the whole gamut. So we did like an online Survey Monkey, very simple sort of survey tool, and that was really pushed out broadly, right? We pushed that out through organizational social media and got just the general community to give input of, and very basic stuff, but it gave us sort of a touch point around like, is environment or jobs more important? Is, poverty reduction or bike lanes more important? We were able to get a pulse from the community in that way. What we ended up doing was doing 40-ish focus groups in in less than 30 days. So pretty much the mantra was, if you'll host us, we will come and talk to you. And so we reached out to every community organization. We went through 211 and sort of pushed out a message through them to organizations who already had pre-existing connections to the community, and then, use those and leverage those to then have conversations with their membership or their attendees. So we went to a couple, there's an organization called Life After 50, which is sort of a senior center. We did 2 sessions there with, each with over 30 seniors, many of them from the West End. It's a senior socialization club or a social community club. And we just chatted with them for an hour, and walked them through, those focus groups were very much, there was like 15 minutes of education and then 45 minutes of visioning of what could it be. And we sort of came in with sort of a structured conversation where we could sort of tell them what the Gordie Howe Bridge is, where's it going to be, and how can this benefit you in a very high level. And then we had sort of buckets of conversation of what would you like to see come from that. And we replicated that, dozens of times across the community. And then we had a handful of open door events, much like what you described at the Hamilton Library. We used Mackenzie Hall, which is a community facility in West Windsor. We used a couple libraries that are in West Windsor and sort of downtown Windsor. And, we went into a couple churches, used church basements, the sort of typical community engagement sort of model of, we will provide the coffee and the cookies, come on out and give, learn a little bit, provide some input, and, have a good conversation. That was really how we went through that process in 6 weeks.
Pretty impressive, and given the shortness of you guys' time frame. So just as we wind things down here, coming up on the hour, can I ask you both what recommendations you had from your experience for the city of Hamilton as we re-enter our Hamilton LRT CBA visioning and finding out exactly what Made in Hamilton Community Benefits Agreement would look like, getting out there to re-engage the public? What would you communicate about your experience that Hamilton needs to be aware of, could learn from?
Go ahead, Brady. You go first.
Sure. I think a major point to make is to make sure people get educated on what community benefits are, and things like even the kind of going through defining those things like social procurement, defining all of that stuff a little bit more ahead of time, then go into that consultation with them and say, okay, now that you're kind of more aware of what these things are, what can you do? I also would say to try to remain positive at all times. I think that it's very easy to be aggressive with something like a community benefits, but it's also very easy to keep it all positive too, because it's definitely always going to benefit the community at the end of the day. So trying to keep that and keep everybody cool.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Brady says. I think there's a little bit of groundwork that you may need to just sort of refresh everyone on what these could be. And it's a great opportunity to sort of vision what positive benefit could be created from this project, right? And so I think it's not a bad idea to let people's imagination within reason run a little wild and sort of say, like, what's your ideal look of your neighborhood after this LRT is built? Like, you still want to live here, but what other stuff do you want here too? I think there's that opportunity to really vision. I think one of the things that'll be interesting from an LRT perspective is, and I think you mentioned this, Carl, it's like 14 kilometers. And so how do you break up that 14 kilometers? Because you're going to need some general benefit along the whole line, but then you're going to need some very nuanced benefit at different points. For different communities or different neighborhoods are going to need different things. And so I think taking the time and really trying to pull out what are some of those community specific nuances along the line, I think is a big piece of work that's going to have to get done. But I think it's going to be something that if you try and, fit a one size fit all community benefit agreement along the whole LRT line, you probably are going to get into a bit of trouble. Trouble maybe is the wrong word, but you're going to miss some opportunity there where if you'd done this just a little bit differently at this section, you could have gotten a whole bunch of extra stuff happening there. And I think the last thing I would say is there's probably an opportunity, and there's probably conversations already happening because they happened in Windsor about who's going to leverage the community, or not the community benefit, but just this project anyways. And how do you leverage their leveraging of it? So, LRTs traditionally have led to gentrification and redevelopment of neighborhoods. It's probably going to happen. Unfortunately, it probably already is happening in some ways. And so it's about how can you, leverage the work that you're doing on this project to then drive positive change on those other projects. So how can you take the ideas or the neighborhood specific items that are coming out of your conversations and amplify them on other projects? So maybe it's the LRT's coming, but then the city's going to build a library a couple blocks away as well near that LRT stop. How can you leverage this work to then drive better outcomes from other work that's going to happen as a result of that project?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of opportunity presented by the Hamilton Light Rail project. There's a question of course, the affordable housing piece that everyone in the city of Hamilton is concerned about along the corridor, and that's something we'll continue to explore in these further webinars. Thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'd perhaps love to have you back maybe a year from now when we're more farther along in the process. Thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate your time. We'll be posting this on YouTube as well as repeating it through our social media channels. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thanks.